So we were looking at what do people read when they're making up their minds on development, especially sort of students, people just coming out of development, getting into the development industry, people who are still open-minded and sort of picking up big narratives. And we saw sort of a set of left-wing narratives from people like Naomi Klein, Samar Amin. We saw an enormous number of aid economist narratives, very prolific people, aid economists. So Jeffrey Sachs, William Easterly, Paul Collier, et al. And it seemed odd that there wasn't an NGO narrative. And so what we tried to do was to pull together almost to out our implicit understanding of development built on 60 years in 70 countries, working on the ground, but also increasingly working at public policy level as well, and to try and see if we could make a coherent whole of it. And I have to say this was a new experience because I don't think we'd ever actually tried to stitch it all together before. It's about 500 people involved, writing papers, arguing, disagreeing, most of them probably inside Oxfam, but also partners and academics. So it's quite a big, it's like sort of mini world development report in terms of shepherding a lot of people to the finishing line. Some of the basics. Okay, some of this is going to be a bit too elementary maybe for the people here, but I'll just run through it quickly. Poor people as agents, not as subjects, not objects. Poor people doing development, poor people with rights, dignity, voice, opinions, passions, trying to get into the heads of poor people. That's the kind of starting point. So it's definitely not looking at development as a sort of technocratic or technical exercise. Starting with inequality rather than poverty as the sort of kick-off point for the book. Looking at countries such as Brazil, not too sure about Zambia. These are World Bank figures, but I suspect there's a zero in the wrong place on Zambia. Where inequality has actually been falling. Brazil has got it down to the lowest level in 30 years through sustained good economic policy. But these are the countries where inequality is rising. Many more of them, and it's rising faster. And then moving out to the other end of the telescope, looking at the globe as a whole, phenomenal levels of inequality, unprecedented. 500 richest people in the world earning the same as the 416 million poorest people, UN figures. And a sort of extraordinarily skewed distribution. So it sets out that as the sort of starting point and then says, what do we do about it? And instead of the usual kind of straight into redistribution of wealth kind of discussion, it actually talks about the need to understand power better. So it's a word we use a lot, and certainly until doing the book, I hadn't read much about, actually. And so I went back to some of the literature on power and sort of the different kinds of power. One nice sort of typology is differentiating between power within, that moment when poor people suddenly start to expect that, to realise they have rights, to expect that their opinions will be taken seriously. Power with, when people come together in associations of one kind or another. Power to do things and power over other actors. And starting to sort of unpack power and then see how power flows within households, within communities. Opportunities, more of a sort of standard discussion really on health, education, early years nutrition as vital ways to break the transmission of poverty and inequality from one generation to the next. So it's talking about tackling the issues of power, opportunities and assets. There's a sort of traditional rehearsal of the importance of land rights, land ownership, land reform, both in rural and urban settings. But I think the more interesting question is taxation. This again is a massive blind spot for the NGOs, certainly. So to actually set out the political importance of taxation, that taxation is that kind of essential link between citizens and states. When citizens pay taxes, they care more about what states do with the money. When states have to raise taxes, they listen to citizens. Historically, it's the formation of a tax-raising bureaucracy is often the start of the formation of a state per se, and then that bureaucracy goes on to take on other roles. And that raises, and if it's that important, then we really should be looking at tax reforms. We should be looking at attempts to move from aid dependence to tax dependence, in terms of where governments get their revenues from, and looking at whether the reforms of the last 20, 30 years have actually been regressive or progressive. So if you look at the changes in tax as a percentage of GDP, it's gone up in the rich countries, flatlined in the middle income countries, and actually fallen over the last couple of decades in low income countries, because the loss of tax revenue from trade taxes has not been replaced by anything else. So you've actually got a declining tax take, which is, I think, disastrous politically. So it takes on some of those issues. The best place to start is actually with the bank publication Voices of the Poor, which I know it's controversial, but I think it's great. And I thought it was a really good attempt to get inside the heads of poor people, and actually it the bank talked to 64,000 poor people in 23 countries and said basically, what's it like? What does living in poverty mean? And from there came an understanding of poverty, which was written up by Deepak Narayan and Robert Chambers and people, that you couldn't get further away from the $1 versus $1.50 a day kind of idea of poverty. It's poverty is humiliation, poverty is shame, poverty is anxiety and fear, and sort of fear that if someone gets injured, there's no fallback, no reserves, and the family's going to spiral down into some horrible place and take years to recover. Humiliation that you can't, and shame that you can't give your children a decent start in life. Shame not being able to look good. It's the only place I've ever read in a development text about how horrible it is not to be able to have decent clothes or afford cosmetics or look good when you're in your prime of life. It just really rang true. So if you start with that notion of poverty, multidimensional poverty, then I think the book argues that the way out of that is active citizenship. It's that moment when the light bulb goes on, people start to become aware of rights and start to actually link up and demand things, change things. It can be through social movements, people waving banners, but it can be through churches, can be through parent-teachers associations, lots of different ways that people link up. But it seems to me that it's an essential part of that of development broadly understood. Okay, so if the issue, so the book's arguing that you need active citizens for that holistic notion of development. You need effective states for the both to allow active citizenship to flourish, but also to actually deliver the economic goods. The question is this the relationship between an active citizen there and a very effective state there? Okay. This is Tiananmen Square, 1989. That's an iconic photo of the repression of the student protest movement. And I think a lot of our partners probably would actually say, yes, citizenship is always going to enter into conflict with the state, and you can't have both. So either you are anti-state and pro-poor people, pro-social movements, or you are the opposite. And the book's arguing that that's a false dichotomy, that there's many examples where the relationship is much more constructive than that one. The three intellectual gurus for the book, the really short executive summary is take a Marcia Sen, Ha-Jun Chang and Danny Roderick, put them in a blender, and you get a kind of development smoothie at the end, which you lash on some Oxfam program examples, and you've got a book. Okay, that's the kind of really short version. And this is a question I asked Ha-Jun Chang, who's written that great book, Bad Samaritans and Kicking Away the Ladder, economic historian who does sort of contrarian truths about history. And his point was that there have been many cases where you've had a sort of large-scale pact between citizens and the state, which has actually galvanised entire countries. The example he gave was Sweden, which in the 1920s was losing more hours to strike action than any other country in the world. Massive political and economic crisis, out of which the government sat down with trade unions and business and agreed a kind of social market economic model, which has transformed the Swedish economy. More recently, you could look at, say, an example like Chile, coming out of dictatorship, where the newly elected government sat down with businesses and trade unions and agreed higher levels of taxation in return for paying off some of the social debt accumulated by the military. So you can see some big pacts leading to growth and stability. Then if all else fails, turn to Danny Roderick. This is from his Greatest Hits album, otherwise known as One Economics, Many Recipes, where he updates all his best papers. It's a really good book. And he looked at 83 examples of high-speed growth since World War II in developing countries and compared growth under democracies with growth under autocracies, and found that you get similar long-term rates of growth with different patterns, in that under democracies there's a lot of feedback loops in the political system. So when you try and do something, people oppose you, so you don't get big booms. When, as Obama's about to find out, when things go wrong, everybody shouts, so you get good feedback when there are problems, so they actually handle shocks better. Under autocracies, you can do all the reforms you like, which sometimes produce big booms, but you don't hear when things are going wrong, so you get big busts. So you get a kind of sawtooth growth pattern under autocracies compared to a smoother pattern under democracies. And from the development point of view, smooth is good because it's those big crashes which ratchet up inequality, because poor people always get hit hardest during the big crashes.